Hello, good afternoon, all. Welcome to this month's member webinar hosted by Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association. I'm Grace Atherton, WCMA's Communications Director, and I'm so glad to have you all with us today as we dive into the latest proposed changes to federal milk marketing orders, or FMMOs, and what these updates mean for your business. First, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Please make sure your mic is muted and your video is off to avoid interruptions during the webinar. You can submit questions anytime during our session in the chat, and we'll do our best to address all of those during our Q&A at the end. And a recording of this webinar, along with a list of resources and helpful contact information, will be shared later this week, so watch for that in your email inbox from me. With that, let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. Very soon, we'll move into our main program, and after that, we will dive into a live Q&A. As I mentioned, please feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat throughout our session, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. Now, to take us into the main event, it's my pleasure to introduce WCMA's Executive Director, John Umhafer. John, take it away.
Thank you, Grace. Welcome, everybody. So yes, I'm John Umhafer, Executive Director of Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association. Happy to have you here with us today. You know, one of our key roles here at WCMA is to serve you as a policy advocate. And we feel like we're a strong voice for folks in both Wisconsin and the Midwest and in Washington, D.C. And we focus our efforts on what's important to you, our members. And recently, that's been working to modernize the outdated federal milk pricing formulas. And as I mentioned with Chuck a moment ago, we've been working on this since 2021, so that nice long road. WCMA has been a key catalyst in the process. Early in 2023, we petitioned USDA to initiate the national public hearing on milk pricing alongside our friends at IDFA. We were seeking key changes to milk pricing formulas, most importantly, updating the make allowances for cheddar cheese, butter, non-fat dry milk, and whey powder. These are the keys, of course, to pricing all milk in the United States. And of course, you know, they're woefully out of date. USDA accepted our proposal back in 2023 and several more from industry. And now, finally, we are nearly at the finish line. After a 6-month public hearing, USDA issued a recommended decision on milk pricing reforms in July. And interested parties, including WCMA, submitted comments on that decision. Now, finally, in a few weeks, USDA will release a final decision, and it will be up to dairy farmers to decide via referendum whether they'll accept USDA's changes or not accept their changes in their regional federal milk marketing orders, which could mean, of course, dissolving an order if they do not accept the changes. Throughout the process, WCMA members have guided our association decisions and recommendations, and today's webinar is meant to continue that outreach to members. We hope you have questions. We look forward to your questions about what USDA's changes to milk pricing will mean for your business. So today I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Chuck Nicholson from the University of Wisconsin. He's going to outline USDA's decisions from July and their potential impact on milk prices. Dr. Nicholson is an associate professor in the Department of Ag and Applied Economics, as well as in the Animal and Dairy Science Department at the University of Wisconsin. Chuck came to Wisconsin in 2022, one of the great hires made possible by Dairy Innovation Hub dollars that the state of Wisconsin has invested in agriculture education and research. In addition to the dairy analysis and policy writing he performs, Dr. Nicholson teaches a food systems and supply chain course and a livestock production and health course in the 2 departments he works with. Chuck previously worked with Nijmegen School of Management in the Netherlands, the Smeal College of Business at Penn State University, and the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. On his EW profile, Chuck states that his main goal is to apply the tools of economics, business, and systems modeling to provide information relevant to decision makers in the dairy industry in Wisconsin and around the country. So we are pleased you're in dairy, Chuck, and we're pleased that you're here with us today. So I want to throw it over to you to run through what USDA's decided.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for the invitation. Let me go ahead and pull up some slides here. Get this to work the way we need to get it to work. Okay, maybe a thumbs up from, okay, Grace is giving me the thumbs up, so that means that you can see what I'm wanting for you to see. I also mentioned, I think John and I have talked a little bit about this, and there'll be some points at which you probably want to add some comments to the things that I've got here, provide a little bit more of a WCMA perspective on things. So my agenda is actually short compared to the amount of time that I'll probably end up talking about some of these things. But the core thing I want to do is provide an overview of the proposed changes that John had mentioned have been in the works for such a long time. Given this audience in particular, we'll focus more on the make allowance proposed changes than on the many other elements that are part of the recommended decision. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the economic analysis that we've done of some of the implications of these make allowance changes. And then in case it's helpful, have a little bit more information provided you about the next steps in the process that primarily involve next steps by USDA and then the producer referendum, the producer vote that will follow from that. So most in this audience probably don't need too much of a reminder about why we went through this long process to make changes, but you do know that make allowances were sort of a key issue. And I understand that from the perspective of a milk buyer for sure, but I think there were some symptoms of a problem that really had more of a direct impact on the farm sector that we're thinking about. In particular, depooling was noted as an issue throughout the hearings. I would also say, and I'll show you a slide in a moment, that actually a trend towards less pooling is also part of the issue that we were looking at here. There were declines in premiums over time. There were cooperatives reblending or making deductions from milk checks compared to the minimum regulated prices. And we saw frequent negative producer price differentials, PPDs. So there were a number of symptoms that were motivating taking action on this issue. Here's one of the pieces of information that I wanted to share with you. This is a little bit of a busy graph. The blue line is actually showing what we call the producer price index for cheese manufacturing. It's the Bureau of Census estimate of what cheese manufacturers have as their overall cost structures on an index basis. And this is sort of showing the cumulative changes over the period since the middle of the last decade. And you can see we saw some quite considerable index increases. Be a little careful because the blue line also includes the cost of milk. And so when milk prices got high in 2022, that actually gets reflected in the indexes here as well. But it's generally showing that there were cost increases that needed to be accounted for. At the same time, I'm showing you, we don't have good data on the overorder premiums that were paid here in this part of the world, the upper Midwest, but we can get an approximation of that by looking at a mailbox price and a producer blend price at test. And if you look at that calculation over time, that same time frame, we saw a quite considerable downward trend. And we also had that interrupted quite a lot by the COVID pandemic where the pricing relationships were very much changed. So here we have kind of the combined costs are increasing for cheese manufacturers and premiums are decreasing for dairy farmers, symptoms of the problem that needed to be addressed. We also, as I mentioned, have seen a declining trend in the total volume of milk produced in the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin that were pooled on order 30. If we go back a little bit longer than the last time frame, I left COVID out because things again got crazy during that time period. But we see there's considerable periods of time where there are wild shifts in the amount of milk that's being pooled, the proportion of milk. That's kind of the symptom of depooling. And then we also see a declining trend over time where we went from being above 80% of that total milk production down below about 75%. So we've actually seen continued growth in milk production in these two states, but we actually haven't seen much of an increase in the amount of milk that's been pooled over that time period. Okay. So those provide a little bit of the background on my perspective about what problems we were trying to address. Let's actually turn now and say, what did USDA say they're going to do, right? So there are many different elements to this decision. We'll talk in a minute about some of that are more important and show how they affect things. But they wanted to change the standard milk composition in part based on how milk components had changed, farm milk components had changed over time. So they made some adjustments there. There were adjustments made to the products that are surveyed for the cheese price that's going to be set to a part of Class 3 pricing. And in particular, that was removing cheese barrels from Class 3 pricing and focusing only on 40-pound blocks. Key thing for this audience, there were increases proposed in all the make allowances for the 4 surveyed products that affect Class 3 and Class 4 pricing. Those increases were between 5 and 7 cents per pound. There was another adjustment to the butterfat retention factor that would also affect the pricing. For folks who are more on the Class 1 side, there are a couple of things that went back to the higher of the advanced Class 3 or Class 4 skim price, rather than what we'd had since 2019, which was an average plus 74 cents. And USDA also made some accommodations for different pricing on extended shelf life milk. The other component of this that I think has a particularly large impact, maybe not so much in this part of the world, but elsewhere, was to propose the increase in Class 1 differentials, retain a 160 minimum value, but increase those nationwide. Here in Wisconsin, that averaged about $1.20 proposed increase in those differentials. So there's a broad spectrum of things that USDA is proposing to do here. We're going to focus a bit more on the make allowance component for this particular webinar, talk a little bit about how the Class 1 affects or interacts with that as well. Okay. So to be more specific about the changes for Class 3 pricing formulas, there were increases proposed in the make allowances, again, for all 4 of the products that are part of the pricing formulas for Class 3 and Class 4. And the other key change was to remove the barrel cheddar price from the Class 3 survey pricing. The modified retention factor is also relevant, and we'll talk more about the standard composition of milk and its impacts here in a moment. All right. So there are also some things that were recommended to USDA or proposed to USDA that they determined were not going to be part of their recommended decision. They mostly related to the product prices that would be surveyed. The first 3 there, mozzarella, 640-pound cheddar, and unsalted butter. And there were also some proposals to increase yield factors that were not part of the recommended decision. Okay. So, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem being plugged up here. I'll try and keep it minimally distractive. So when USDA was trying to figure out what to do about make allowances, they had evidence from a variety of different sources. And so there's some different ways that we can think about what an appropriate value of the make allowance might be. One that was presented as evidence by my colleague and friend Mark Stevenson were actual plant surveys of the cost of processing in 2 different survey rounds that provided a range and a value for cost of processing for cheese and other dairy products. We can also use some economic engineering studies that say if a plant operates under these kinds of assumptions, here's what we might expect the cost to be. And we can actually do statistical or econometric analyses of cost information and try and understand what factors affect that cost, and then come up with estimates and a range of possible values for those processing costs. Basically, USDA had all of these kinds of information presented to them when they made the decision. And so they also have to figure out not just, they get a distribution of values that's presented by most of these methods. They also then have to pick a line in the sand where they're going to decide that that value needs to sit. And so that's how the process worked through those 6 months of hearings where the focus was on make allowances. Okay, so I want to provide a little bit of a visual summary here of kind of where we have been, the current side there, some of the recommendations by folks more on the producer side, National Milk, folks on the cheesemaker side, and where USDA came out. And you'll see a series of graphs where I talk about the cheese make allowance, the dry whey make allowance, and the butter make allowance. And these graphs all have the same basic feature, and that is the recommended decision is certainly higher than the current values that are proposed, higher than where National Milk had recommended the make allowances be set, higher than where WCMA started with their progressive scale of increasing make allowances over time, but not approaching the highest values that were recommended by WCMA. Right? So here is the cheese make allowance proposal. You can see sort of right smack dab in the middle there is where USDA went. As I mentioned, we have a similar kind of pattern when we think about the dry whey make allowances, much higher than current values, but splitting the difference in a sense between national milk and the highest WCMA proposals. And again, a similar proposal on the butter make allowances. Okay, so it's clear to me from this that USDA was sort of trying to strike some middle ground, basing it on the evidence that was provided to them from these different sources I mentioned, but striking out a position that was in the middle. Okay. So with that in mind, maybe we can think a little bit more about some of the kind of specifics of the impacts of changing these, okay? And some of you are highly familiar with these different formulas, others perhaps less so. This slide has a lot of detail, but mostly what I'm trying to illustrate here is the places where there's red in these different formulas that we're looking at are places where USDA is proposing to make a change to how we would price Class 3 milk. And you can see those changes affect the other solids price, that component price, the butterfat price, and ultimately through the impact on the protein value and butterfat value in cheese, the protein price. Okay. Also, if you notice the Class 3 skim milk price there, I've got a red value of the 3.3. That's reflecting a composition change in the other solids. The 6.0 value is reflecting the increase from 5.9. So overall, there are a number of different pieces that will affect what that Class 3 milk price would look like going forward. I'm using kind of the most recent month that we have data for to illustrate how these changes would work. Later, we're going to talk about kind of what we might project to be impacts going forward. Okay. So here is actually maybe trying to summarize it in a little bit, maybe a little bit easier to read format, what the changes would likely mean if we looked at the product prices in September 24 and looked at what that meant in terms of a change in the component values for butterfat, protein, and other solids. And you can actually see there that in each case, the proposed changes would result in a reduction in the component values for the butterfat of about a little less than 7 cents a pound, same on the other solids price, and a little bit larger value on the protein side. Okay? So interestingly, the way these formulas are working is that that change in the component value is always going to be about that level for the butterfat and the other solids. And it'll vary a little bit for protein based on the relative values of cheese and butterfat. Okay. So when we've looked at this in sort of recent months, in addition to September, you get about a dime on the protein price is the reduction in that component value with the new product price formulas in place, or those new make allowance values in place. All right. So let's then break it down in a little bit more specific way to think about the components of the Class 3 price and the impacts. So one of the key things we need to start with if we're thinking about Class 3 is the Class 3 skim milk price. And if your eyes are getting a little glazed over by this, maybe you go over to the right-hand side and say, under the current formulas in September 2024, that skim milk price would have been $11.09. With the proposed changes, that goes down a dime to $10.99. Okay, so that's the skim milk price side. We need that as a part of the component of calculating the Class 3 price. Here, similar kind of set of calculations showing the change in the Class 3 price, and this would be at 3.5%, not at test, would be about 32 cents reduction there in that reported price. And then we can also evaluate this on the basis of changes in the values of components at the producer test that was reported, and I'm using August milk for that here. But what you see is when we adjust actually both the component values based on the make allowance changes and the milk at test, we actually end up with a fairly larger reduction in the value of components of Class 3 at test, right? So all I'm trying to do here is sort of use this as a way to lead into the next slide. And I should mention here also, These are changes for milk that's currently pooled, right? That's what we would report as the minimum prices that would be paid. If milk is not being pooled, it's probably receiving a deduction on that class 3 value. And so it's a little bit difficult to say that these would be the impacts on that milk because we know they're probably already below those values. So in fact, they could see an increase in the value of milk and components if they're currently not being pooled. Okay, so here I'm actually just trying to show a similar kind of summary graph for both class 3 and class 4 now. If we think about the component values, that's that 92 cents that I showed for September 2024 on class 3 at components. As a reported class 3 price, that's the 32 cent kind of value there, and we can do a similar kind of calculation for class 4 milk. Key differences here really for the components, the composition change from the standard composition of skim milk, including higher proportions of protein and other solids or non-fat solids, that composition change offsets to some extent the change in the component values. And so that's why the orange bars are higher up than the blue bars. And again, this is an indication of pricing for milk that is currently being pooled or would have been pooled in September 2024. If milk's not currently pooled or is being reblended by co-ops, we don't really have a good sense, but the likely changes are smaller. Okay. All right. So a lot of times, if you've been following this, you may have seen folks in USDA did actually something similar where they look back over the last 5 years and they said, if we change the formulas, here's what would have happened. And I think that can be a useful exercise, but I think we got to be a little bit careful. And that's why I haven't presented that kind of analysis so far, because if we took $1 off the value of milk components for dairy farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota, we'd probably see some changes in production. We'd also see some changes in the amount of milk that cheesemakers might want to buy. And we'd have a dynamic that would play out over time. And so looking at a single month or looking back at the last 5 years maybe gives us a little bit of a sense for how the formulas would work. But I would say often they're not a really good assessment of what we might expect in terms of changes going forward. So that's kind of my cautionary message there about that. With that in mind, let me think a little bit about some of the likely impacts of these proposed changes. Okay, so there are differences between orders that price on the basis of components and those that price on butterfat skim. I'm going to focus on those multiple component pricing orders. We're likely to see component values and producer paychecks be lower. Doesn't mean the milk price has to be lower if there are other offsetting factors, but the value of components will be lower. We should see some higher PPDs than we have seen in the past. And as a part of that, this leads us into talking a little bit about the class 1 differentials that would be part of generating those higher PPDs. This is the set of proposed changes that USDA has across 3,108 counties in the United States. Their proposed changes to the class 1 differentials. Again, I mentioned for Wisconsin, that value is about $1.20 or so. And so you can see everywhere they've increased them, but by bigger amounts in some places than others. Their average proposed change is about $1.24 per hundredweight, which is going to be added in terms of that class 1 value to the pool, making for higher value above the components. But if you think about the make allowance changes, about half of that will be offset by a reduction in the base class 1 skim milk price. And so the net is probably about half of what we're looking at here in terms of the reported class 1 differentials. So there's going to be some value added to the pool based on those increases in class 1 values. Okay. So doing some quick math for a couple of different orders that have different utilization of milk here in order 30, obviously 90+% of our milk going into class 3. That's about $1 million added per month to the pool, 3 to 5 cents per hundredweight over the total pool. That's about 10% higher than the average PPD in this order in the last few years. Order 1 in the Northeast, about double that amount added to the pool. Given the size and nature of the pool, that's about a 19 to 21 cent increase over the total pool, or about 7% higher average PPD in 2024. So this is the kind of the basis of the statement that we ought to see some higher PPDs and we ought to see more milk being pooled as a result of that. We would also expect, and we have some economic calculations in the modeling work we do that suggests improved margins for cheesemakers, and perhaps also then the return of some premiums as we get prices down, the minimum prices down to a level where they're not so much binding anymore as they have been in the past. Okay? So those are kind of the high level things that I think are likely to take place as we go forward here. I mentioned earlier that looking back can be kind of dangerous. Everybody uses the analogy of driving while looking in the rearview mirror. But I want to walk us through maybe a little bit of the logic about what might happen and how this would play out over time. Okay. So what a lot of folks have been focused on recently is increased make allowance, lower farm milk price for pooled milk. Okay. And that might be some beginning kind of point. But I think we need to think about what happens after that. Well, that lower farm milk price probably results in some adjustments in milk production on the part of producers, can also result in some increased demand for farm milk for cheese. And those two things taken together are meaning that we're affecting the milk supply and demand balance across the country. That probably has some implications for price premiums that might get paid. We are likely going to see some more milk being pooled than we've seen in the past. And that leads me to talk about the fact that there can be some offsetting positive effects on farm pay prices. So we should be careful about just sort of starting the storyline with increased make allowance, lower farm milk price, because over time there'll be some adjustments that take place that are likely to move in the direction of offsetting some of those initial reductions in component values at the farm level. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is kind of try look forward a bit and think about our projections based on some economic modeling work that we have done that would look at how these values might play out over time. And I'm not making this some kind of guarantee of this will actually happen. There's some wiggle room around all of the different values that I'll show you. But I think it illustrates the basic idea that this will play out over time, and we're likely to see some differences between years and also between the different classes. So what I'm going to do is sort of show you what I think our estimates of the price impacts would be for the next 4 years going forward here, and then an overall average. And for class 3, this is again the reported class at 3.5%. We might expect something that looks like this if we look across the entire US. For class 4, we actually see a bit of a different pattern, and you might say, why are those values getting higher in those later years? And the answer is that's actually part of that milk supply and demand adjustment that I mentioned earlier, okay? So initial increases, our initial decreases in class 3 and some bouncing around to class 4 ultimately lead us to overall an increase in class 4 at that 3.5 test and a reduction in class 3, but it's not on average as low as it is in some of the years that we're showing here, okay? If we do this on the basis of components, we see a little bit different picture because I mentioned the component values don't take into account that change in the milk composition that the blue bars do here for class 3. But you can see we see a response over time, and some things that start out as relatively large negative effects become smaller negative effects over time. And we look at class 4 components, they mirror the, the patterns that we see for class 4 milk. So key point is here, this is also for milk that's currently being pooled, but there are going to be effects that play out over time. And those will also play out a little bit differently for class 3 and class 4 milk. Okay. So I want to show, again, sort of the other side of the picture here, where we look at class 1, class 2, and the overall all milk price in the US. And what that's actually showing us is we see increases in class 1. That's based on those class 1 differential increases. And that actually also plays out over time. You actually see those higher prices in later years being driven by class 4 being the higher of in those situations. But overall, the impacts on the all milk price, other than in a year after implementing something like this, are fairly modest. And overall, we get to a place where there's a minor negative impact on the expected all milk price for the U.S. as a whole as a result of the recommended decision over the next 5 years. Okay. And this is actually just a repeat to put it into perspective here of what I showed you previously, where we're looking at class 3 and class 4. Okay. So key points, there's a dynamic that plays out over time. The classes will probably be affected differently. Okay. I also wanted to maybe focus in a little bit more on the situation here in order 30. And what this graph is actually trying to do is take into account a little bit of what USDA tried to do, where they looked at doing what they call rerunning the pools, using different values with the same pooled milk values. And so what I tried to do for order 30 was to sort of adjust the likely utilization of milk in the order, recognizing that higher class 1 milk prices were going to have some dampening effect on demand for fluid milk. And then also to look at a blend price at 3.5 within order 30, the changes there. That's actually being shown by those light blue bars. And when the Western order went out in 2004, what we tended to find was that the pay prices for milk approximated class 3 milk prices, not actually exactly in every month, but over time, roughly speaking, looked like class 3. And so I've got a class 3 here, the yellow bars at 3.5%, which is kind of like what we might expect if we didn't have order 30 to be in place, and how these values would play out over time, and then an average value. Okay. And so partly what you're looking at here is the difference in the pooled value of milk. Generally, if you look at this, is about 5 cents per hundredweight. Okay, so again, variation and effects over time, trying to capture a little bit how the changes in utilization in order 30 might affect what that blend price might be, or if we didn't have order 30, milk was completely depooled, what that value would look like. Okay, so the basic takeaway on all this is I think there was a pretty strong consensus that changes in the make allowances were needed. And the discussion that is ongoing now is really about how much of an adjustment did we need. John will tell you more about how much of an adjustment we need here in a moment. The impacts are going to play out all over time, so we shouldn't just look back or look at only 1 year. Some of the questions that are open are the extent to which overorder premiums are going to return. And we expect part of the dynamic to be some milk supply adjustments in different parts of the U.S., as I mentioned, and sort of documenting what I think these dynamic impacts are likely to be. Okay, so I'm going to let John actually talk a little bit about this, because this is adding to the previous graph that you had seen, but adds in suggested changes that were made as a part of the comment period to USDA.
Sure. What you're seeing there in the blue on the right is our comment made in September after the recommended decision came out. What we saw in the comments forming up this fall was that there was still a lot of opposition to make allowance increases from on the farm side, and we at Wisconsin Cheesemakers wanted to defend the position that clearly make allowances did need to increase since 2008. And when we read the recommended decision, USDA did take one of the two components we used to look at where should we put make allowances. They took away the Bill Sheik data, which was pushing the California plant survey information from that ended in 2016. He had pushed that forward, saying, given inflation, given other cost factors, what should the make allowance be? And we had added that to the Mark Stevenson study from 2023, saying, what are your plant's costs in 2022? And we put those together as an association, as did IDFA. And we came up with the numbers you see there, that range from 24 rising through 28, trying to get to that 28 cents there on the cheese side. Well, USDA, as I said, took away one of the two pieces we used to reach that 28 cents. They took away the Sheik data, leaving us with the 2023 data from Stevenson. So we said, well, then let's use the 2023 data from Stevenson. And that is reflected there in the blue. That was the survey of cheddar plants around the country with great participation, saying it costs us 26 cents, 26.4 cents to make cheddar cheese these days. This was big plants and small. It was a good survey. So USDA came out, as you know, with 25 cents there in the green. And we thought, well, if they're going to take away half our rationale, we're gonna stick with the other half because it was the best data presented in the entire hearing. And in often cases, it was the only, you know, defendable data presented in the hearing was that 26 cents. So on cheddar there, that's what we stuck with. And if we advanced it, you'll see that we basically followed along with the 2023 survey information from Stevenson, saying, okay, if we can't modify that with the Sheik data, then we have the Stevenson data. And here's what it said. It said 33 cents on dry whey. And it said, we have got them for butter there too. It said 31 cents for butter. And I don't think I put the non-fat one in this because we're talking about class 3 here. So wanted you to know that that's what the association put into our comments in September. And because we're not done yet here, there's still a final decision to come out. And USDA got a lot of feedback saying we still don't like make allowances, but we had to step in and say, well, we actually desperately need these make allowance changes. So we took a defensive position saying, here's the data that was put before you and that you accepted. So that's where we wanted to stand.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, John. I'll also note I have a very industrious PhD student who's working with me on dairy economics, which is kind of a rarity these days, who had gone through all 128 of the different comments and sort of listed a for and against the different components of the decision that that USDA released. And for the most part, these were dairy farmers or dairy farmer organizations. And interestingly, for all of the other components other than make allowances, the opinions were pretty evenly split. But on make allowances, it was 8-1 against. So I think John's right in saying that there's a considerable amount of concern at best out there related to that issue. So let me then segue into like the last part of what we want to talk about before we get to Q&A, which is to sort of think about where we are and where this process goes. So many of you are probably aware that on the 13th of September, USDA closed out on receiving comments. I just mentioned a quick summary of some of those comments that they're currently reviewing. In mid-November, they will release a final decision. And I've got a little asterisk there that every time I talk to somebody from USDA, they say, at the discretion of Secretary Vilsack, there will be a final decision. Kind of implying that there might not be one, but I really can't see how that would not happen. But I'm just doing that as a little bit of a covering action because they always tell me that that's what the situation is. Early in 2025, USDA is likely to hold the producer referendum, the producer vote. And then after they have accommodated the voting process, they will implement whatever amendments are approved by the producers, as John mentioned, in the different orders. Okay. So many of you are probably familiar with this, and John mentioned this earlier, but the option is not, I want to keep what I have or I don't. The option is, I want to accept the changes or I want to have nothing. So I accept the changes that are released in the final decision to be determined, or I have no federal order pricing in my order. Okay, so maintaining the current provisions is not an option, and the voting is by order, not for the system as a whole. So when USDA announces the final decision, it's also going to give us the details about the voting process. They will choose what they consider to be a representative month that counts for producer eligibility to vote. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in a moment. And the timing of the vote is basically, they will say when the ballots must be received back by USDA. Typical time frame would be 30 to 45 days. Okay. So who gets the vote? Producers that deliver milk to a handler regulated in an order and that are currently actively engaged in producing grade A milk. And on the cooperative side, cooperatives who represent producers who are basically in those categories and actively marketing milk and recognized by USDA are eligible to vote. And the cooperative part is important because cooperatives, as you probably are aware, are allowed to block vote on behalf of all their members. To do that, they actually have to provide USDA with a certification of the resolution of the co-op board authorizing that vote when they submit the ballots. But if a cooperative doesn't block vote, it can allow its members to cast individual ballots. Okay. So what's the voting threshold? 2/3 of the voting producers must approve. And that means that if I have a bunch of producers that didn't vote, it's 2/3 of the votes that actually were that were placed that actually count, not 2/3 of the total number of producers that are part of the eligible population in an order. USDA is going to first look at whether the 2/3 threshold for producers is met. If so, then the order is retained with the changes. If they don't see that, then they would look at 2/3 of the milk volume, which is a little bit more involved process, because then you got to associate a volume of milk with each of the producers. Okay. Under the block voting, cooperatives can cast a unanimous ballot for all their membership, which contributes towards both the 2/3 of the voting producers or the milk volume. Okay. So that's a little bit about the basic process that we'll go through from here. As a kind of a quick summary, it's important to keep in mind that the overall impacts of these proposed changes will depend on all the things that USDA had in the recommended decision. I focused a little bit more on the make allowances here for this particular audience. That means that in part, the impacts are going to vary by order based on their utilization of milk, and there's some differences between the component pricing orders and the skim butterfat orders. And as I mentioned earlier, these effects are going to play out over time. And so we're going to have to see an adjustment process take place, the evolution of kind of the milk buyer and the milk seller relationship. Right? In case it's helpful, we have a series of different summary pieces on aspects of this decision, including on make allowances, that are available at our Dairy Markets and Policy website. You see the URL there, the address. If any of that is helpful, I wanted to make that available to folks if they're interested. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up that part, and maybe I'll stop the sharing here. And if we need to go back to slides, we can do that. But thanks a lot for listening.
Well, thank you, Chuck. I'm hoping folks pop up with a question, perhaps in the chat is the easiest thing for me to see. Maybe we'll see a hand raised in the group, and they could speak verbally. I do have a few questions that I developed out of your presentation, and I can start with those if I don't see anyone break away from their shyness here for a moment. But hopefully some will come in. So let me start with the question. I noticed that the pooling in order 30 in one of your early slides, it seemed to be settling out a bit toward the end of the right side of the graph these days, and it was a little higher than I expected at about 75%. And I guess I was wondering what you think might happen as we implement. Will there be more incentive for a cheesemaker to stay in the order, given that class 1 coming up versus the make allowances going down? Where do you think we'll net out with the ability or the interest in staying in order 30?
Yeah, I mean, I'm I'm a little bit mindful of not reading the minds of many of the people who are on the call here, but kind of the economic incentives would suggest you have a little bit more in the pool that might be of interest to folks. You have a little bit maybe more of an ability to meet those minimum pay prices based on the changes to the make allowances. I guess my projection would be we would see maybe more stability in that percentage number going forward and maybe a slight increase, but I actually wouldn't expect, based on the kind of incentives that we're looking at here, that there would be a dramatic shift in the average percentages. Where we may see a little bit more of a difference is in the percentage of time or the percentage of milk that gets depooled over time. A little bit more stability in the size of the pool.
Did see that was coming out to about 3 to 5 cents 100 in a given month. So it's not dramatic, this class 1 impact in the upper Midwest anyway.
No,
so
exactly.
I don't think you'll see a rush to the pool, but it may turn some negatives into positives slightly.
Yeah, economists like to talk about a lot of stuff at the margin. And I think that's kind of where we're at with this is it's a marginal change rather than a wholesale shift of things. Yeah.
Although I think at the same time, and I don't know if Mike Brown's on, but there's shifts in the amount of deduct you'll see as you move further and further from Chicago in the upper Midwest, more than there was before. So they're more dramatically seeing a deduction in that order pool take. So
yeah, and we've had some conversations about how that the outzone milk there is going to be sort of less interested. Yeah,
yes,
so that could be another factor.
So there is the flip side of this, though. We think there's going to be this magic class one money pouring into pools, and you had your nice chart showing how that it's going to rise $1.20 on average around the country. But this means that a class one bottler is going to find money to pay for a higher class one differential, and that means they're going to have to turn to the consumer. So I guess what's your take as an economist on what will happen when the price of fluid milk, bottled milk in the grocery store has to rise to cover these class one differentials?
Yeah. So we had a separate workshop for a day in the middle of September where I presented some information related to that, focusing on more on the changes to class one pricing. And the estimate that we had in a way similar to what I showed you over the next 5 years was that probably meant about 11 cents a gallon on a price of milk nationwide over that time period. And so that, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but it was about maybe like a 1% reduction in class one sales as a result of that. So the interesting thing about that was we had on this panel, Mike Brown, I don't know if he's on, but if he is, he can probably speak for himself. And then we also had Cal Covington, who was representing Southeast milk producers. And they had sort of some different takes on that. The Southeast milk folks were saying, well, retailers price milk in a lot of different ways, so how do we really know what they're going to do as a result of this? And I do think that at some point, the increased costs from class one are likely to get passed along. And so it may not happen instantaneously, it may happen differently in different regions with different competitive retail pressures. But I don't think you can push on one part of that system and not have some other part ultimately have to respond.
Right, that's an interesting part of what the future is going to look like. I do see we had a question come in, says here from Bob. I bet I know what Bob that is. The pooling percentage is largely set by the portion of the market controlled by cooperatives. They have little incentive to depool if they can
Yeah,
reblend. So he's saying, I guess, that they'll stay in the pool, and so that's a large part of that 75% you might see, say, in the upper Midwest.
yep, agree.
So alongside that, there is the question of, we did have a provocative question from a member saying, how can we support a recommended decision that really, and you did show a slight benefit to producers, but there's not a wow factor. As you said before we began, this was a lot of work to come up with what you showed as an overall milk change, almost negligible in your 5-year outlook. We'll end up where we started.
I guess one way to look at this is that USDA went through hundreds of hours of testimony and thousands of pages of documents and came up with something that would, over 5 years, keep the all milk price about exactly the same as where it was, while adjusting for some of the other concerns on different parts of the industry. And I don't want to kind of overemphasize some of the modeling results because we do know there's uncertainties and we do know there's a lot of shocks that can happen to trade. We hope, God forbid, there's no more shocks like COVID. But I think what we're trying to do is sort of illustrate the basic kinds of effects that we might expect to see as we look forward here that would account for some of the adjustments that we don't really account for as we look back. So by that kind of economic modeling estimate, milk prices overall will vary during the next 5 years in a way that they didn't before, but the averages are going to come out to be fairly similar to what we've seen taken for the nation as a whole. And I'll add that we
Your
don't really have,
model
sorry?
would include the higher of, as you're throwing the higher of, I'm sure, into the model.
Yes, so the things that I showed you, especially at the end when I was looking at class one and class two, basically are all the different pricing provision components that we can model that were part of the recommended decision. Yep. Yeah.
Seeing a note here popping up, Kurt Ellis, we price some of our cheese based on the class 3 price, but we buy milk on the components. How much difference will that standard milk composition change our margins? That's an interesting question. The composition changes were
Yeah,
noteworthy.
so I think in the mind of USDA, the composition changes were sort of to provide at least an offset to the changes in the make allowances, right? So to make the reported value of a class 3 price at 3.5%, look not as bad as the change in the value of the components there. So the graphs I showed actually provide some kind of indication of what that spread might be for both a particular month, the September 24 month, which I think was about 60 cents between class 3 components, impact on class 3 components and the impact of class 3 at 3.5. So that kind of gives you a sense for what the impact of that compositional change is there. And then you saw actually in the 5-year projections going forward, there's kind of a similar pattern that the reported class 3 was a smaller impact than the component values. And those some of the orders of magnitude are shown there, I guess.
A question come in from Sam here. Why the removal of the cheese barrel market pricing? I don't know if you had a chance to pour through all the comments from USDA within their decision, but they did seem to want to get down to one element for the class 3. I know that, or one cheese element for the class 3.
Yeah, I mean, my reading of that was essentially that they found the barrel price market to be destabilizing somehow. The fairly dramatic changes that we've seen is the demand for that product has changed over time. And I think the logic was we price a lot of cheese off of CME plus or minus now. We can figure out a way to do that with barrels, and you'd have the reported price only based on those 40-pound blocks. We actually in the workshop we did earlier, showed that if you had taken the barrels out, again, these backward-looking things, there would have been a minor price increase overall for class 3, but it was a fairly modest sort of change. There's a lot of variation around that month to month. It's the variation that tends to get folks concerned about things, but as a long-term average, even with the recent things that we've seen with barrel prices, we wouldn't have seen a big long-term average that was very much different.
Which do you think, Chuck, which price series was the true market clearing price in cheese, though? You think it was the barrels or the blocks? If we're looking for a base price?
Well, I think we would think about the volumes of product that are moving through those. But I think USDA was being a little bit more of a traditionalist there by sticking with the 40-pound blocks. So.
I'll let you touch that. Andy asks, do we have any indication on how producers are planning to vote in Order 30? That's a great question.
So I don't have any formal inside information, other than I think what I have heard from folks, and so take that for what it's worth, is that co-ops are likely to block vote, and that block vote is likely to be in favor of the changes in the orders. Okay? So I don't want to put odds on it, but if I had to pick one or the other, I'd say we're probably retaining Order 30.
Okay. Appreciate your taking a stance on that. Hard to predict the future.
Yep. So if I'm wrong, you can come back and let me know.
Well, I wonder if there's any other questions from the audience. I appreciate that they popped up along the way, and we've got another minute or two if you'd like, or we can wrap things up. We're very close to the wrap up at 1:55, so this could suffice, but going once, going twice on another, there comes one, a big fat one to finish here. One of the initial justifications for the orders was to assure a supply of fluid milk for consumers. Got it. Would you agree that the Federal Milk Marketing Order administrators largely ignored evidence that fluid milk demand is becoming increasingly elastic? Is the large increase tax, as he's calling it, on fluid milk, this differential rise as a tax, in light of consumer concerns with food inflation, could be a political problem? I would say yes, but what do you say, Chuck?
Yeah, there's actually a lot there to unpack. So, I think USDA has got some pretty tight, boundaries within which it can work. And so it sees evidence that says we need to change the make allowances. So they do that, and they see evidence that suggests that the class 1 differentials need to be modified, and so they take that evidence and they modify those. And I think you can construe that, and I think that's what USDA would say is the case, that they're actually trying to be true to the spirit of the orders that are primarily focused on regulating fluid milk. But they're trying to adequately reflect, kind of the current cost structures across the industry. And so, I think leaving aside whether or not, well, I guess, there is evidence that a fluid milk product is more demand elastic than it used to be. Even among economists, still folks will disagree about exactly how elastic that's become. And it depends a lot on which data series you use. And my old buddy, Harry Kaiser from Cornell, is kind of on one side of that. And there's other folks that use scanner data and come up with a completely different answer. So I think the evidence is a little bit, maybe not as certain as we'd like it to be for that. But USDA would probably say that's not really our mandate. Our mandate is to determine what those class 1 differentials should be, maybe without thinking too much exactly about what those demand impacts might be. And that's kind of what I'm saying. They're kind of working within the existing system. Here's the rules we have. Here's what they say we're supposed to do. And so that's how we're going to do it.
That's interesting. I would tend to agree with that. Given no other thoughts, I think we're in a good time here to toss the ball back to Grace Atherton from my team, and thank Chuck very much for a great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me all right? Just checking my sound here. Sometimes it goes on and off for me. Great. Thank you again, John, and thank you so much, Chuck, for joining us today. That was a fascinating discussion, especially as someone who's not nearly as familiar as the two of you are with this complicated topic. I want to put in one last plug before we go here for WCMA's next free member webinar. This will be on Tuesday, November 5th at 1 p.m. CT. We'll cover everything dairy manufacturers and processors need to know about participating in the upcoming 2025 U.S. Championship Cheese Contest. We'll talk through how to enter, how products are evaluated at the competition, and how you can make the most of your participation, whether or not you win a medal. So please make sure to mark your calendar for that. You can register for it right now at wischeesemakers.org/events. And we'll include a link to that in our follow-up email as well. Again, that follow-up will have a link to a recording of this webinar, as well as plenty of contact information and helpful resources that we used today. So watch for that from me in your email inbox later this week. Thank you all again for joining us. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.